Hello, and welcome to the official worst movies of 2024 list. Now, I forgot to mention this in the introduction video that I made, but this is going to be a huge list, and I mean a huge list. The fact that there are 15 movies on this list, I think it should have made that obvious, but I want to go into detail as to why these 15 movies are bad. For your convenience, and also for my convenience as well, this list will be split up into 5 separate videos. Part 1 will cover number 15 to number 13, Part 2 will cover number 12 to number 10, Part 3 will cover number 9 to number 7, Part 4 will cover number 6 to number 4, and finally, Part 5 will cover number 3 to number 1. If you enjoyed these videos, then be sure to like them, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. And with all that said, let's get started. These are the top 15 worst movies of 2024. Let us begin. Starting off the list with number 15, you have Harold and the Purple Crayon. Now, this was a movie that I went into knowing it was going to be a bad movie, which will be a surprisingly very common thing for almost all of the movies on this list. Almost every movie that's on this list, I went into knowing they were gonna be bad in some way, shape, or form. Some of these movies I would go out and watch because of the fact that they received terrible reviews, and not despite the fact that they received terrible reviews. And some of these movies, I would watch the trailer for them and I'm like, what the hell is this? This looks like complete garbage, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm really curious as to what this movie is like. And Harold and the Purple Crayon over here falls into the latter category. This movie is based on the old children's book of the same name. I'm sure y'all are familiar with this book. I'm sure y'all have read it in like kindergarten or whatever, maybe as a bedtime story, I don't know. But this is a book that I'm sure y'all are familiar with. And so here we are with a movie adaptation of this classic children's book. And for whatever reason, they chose to make a Harold and the Purple Crayon movie one of those long dead, long irrelevant, long outdated, what if cartoon character was in the real world kind of movies. You know, you think about it in the 2000s and early 2010s, you had stuff like Alvin and the Chipmunks and the Smurfs, Garfield, Yogi Bear, you know, like those kinds of movies. Yeah, Harold and the Purple Crayon is like those kinds of movies. Except this didn't come out in like 2009. This came out in 2024. And so that's just one of many things that leads to this being one of the strangest movies I've ever seen. Like, I'm still in disbelief that this is a real movie that exists. Okay, so the decision to have a Harold and the Purple Crayon movie just be one of these generic cartoon character enters the real world movies that's already questionable enough on its own. But what's even more questionable is the fact that it decided to make Harold a fully grown adult in this movie and not a little boy like in the original book. The movie starts off with him as a little boy, and then it very quickly shows him as an adult. And then, as if it wasn't strange enough already, they decided, yeah, let's get Shazam over here. Let's get Zachary Levi to play Harold. Why the hell not? Now, there are a few unironically good things that I will say about this movie. This movie begins and ends with this 2D animated segment where you have like Harold in the cartoony world. He lives in this world that's created entirely with his purple crayon. And I have to admit, these 2D animated moments, they're actually good. They're unironically really good. They're charming. The movie briefly starts off with Harold as a little boy, as they tell you who Harold is, and then it very quickly cuts to Harold as an adult, and you know what? It actually still works when it's 2D animated. It's when it becomes live action, that's when it becomes weird seeing Harold as an adult, but in this animated segment, it still works. It still retains a lot of that charm. It reminds me so much of the Curious George movie from 2006. 2006. Like, it has the same energy to it. I'm not gonna lie, I wish the entire movie was like this, because then this would have been like a genuinely charming animated movie. At the same time though, I don't necessarily have a problem with the road that this movie chose to go down. The only other unironically positive thing that I will say about this movie is that it kinda has an interesting reason to have Harold enter the real world. Now, with a lot of these cartoon characters enter the real world movies, they could go two ways. Either they have the cartoon character just be part of the real world from the start, like with Alvin and the Chipmunks or Yogi Bear, or they have the cartoon character enter the real world via magical mumbo jumbo or whatever, like with the Smurfs or Fat Albert. This movie falls into the latter. Well, maybe not really. It leans closer to the latter than to the former, but it does have surprisingly a kind of interesting reason to have Harold enter the real world. So as I mentioned before, Harold lives in a world that's just created entirely by his purple crayon. Everything that exists around him exists because of his purple crayon. And then this eventually leads to Harold wondering, who created him? Who created Harold himself? And this makes him curious. This makes him want to go into the real world and find who created him. And I gotta be honest, that's kind of an interesting, unexpectedly existential reason to have this character enter the real world. In universe, it is an interesting question to ask. Everything that exists in this world around Harold was created with his purple crayon, but then who created Harold himself? I'll give the movie that. That's kind of an interesting reason to have him enter the real world. And then that's it. Those are the only unironically good things I will say about this movie. So Harold enters the real world, and he becomes Zachary Levi, and all of a sudden it is no longer charming seeing Harold as a grown adult man anymore. In the cartoon world, Harold has two best friends, a moose and a porcupine, and so subsequently they enter the real world as well. The moose becomes off-brand Kevin Hart. You could clearly tell they were trying to have this character be like a Kevin Hart-esque character, but I guess they weren't able to get Kevin Hart in this movie. Maybe the budget wouldn't allow it. Maybe Kevin Hart was busy doing a movie that would come out shortly after, foreshadowing for a later movie on this list. I don't know, but whatever the case may be, you look at this character, you watch this character, and you could clearly tell, he's trying to be like off-brand Kevin Hart, Kevin Lung, you could say. And then the porcupine becomes this, goth punk girl for some reason, and it's, so stupid. It is one of the most surreal things I've ever seen, but it's also absolutely hilarious at the same time. So in the real world, there's a mom and her kid, and they genuinely could not be any more generic. They're just the generic real world characters. There is literally nothing interesting to say about them. And yet, their genericness adds to the funny bad nature of this movie. The main villain of this movie is this librarian that wants to have his fantasy novel published, but he's unable to have it published. And so by the end of the movie, he tries to steal Harold's purple crayon so that he could have his fantasy novel become a reality. And it's just really stupid, the whole thing. It's just ridiculous. This is the only movie I could think of that's both so bad it's good and generic as hell at the same time. This movie is funny bad because of how generic it is. It's like an outdated form of generic, This could easily pass as a generic kids movie from 2011. Except this movie didn't come out in 2011. This movie came out in 2024. If this movie had come out alongside Alvin and the Chipmunks and the Smurfs, then it wouldn't be funny bad. It would fit in perfectly. But it's the fact that this movie came out long after Alvin and the Chipmunks, long after the Smurfs, and yet it's on the same level of quality as those two movies. That's what makes it funny bad. My theater experience watching this movie was one of the funniest theater experiences I ever had. It was a nearly empty theater. There were only a few other people there, and it's I think they cared even less about this movie than I did. I was probably the only one that was passionately excited for this movie because it looked so terrible. And so there's just moments in the movie where I was just dying of laughter watching it. This movie has the generic third act sad moment that a lot of bad kids movies have. and it's like unintentionally hilarious. I felt like I was watching a fever dream. I honest to God, it felt like I was watching a fever dream movie. There's no way this was a real movie that exists. What do you mean this isn't some obscure kids movie from 2009? What do you mean this came out in 2024? There's no way that's true. There's no way that's the case. This is the only funny bad movie on the entire list. Some of the later movies have a few funny bad moments in them, but this is the only movie on the entire list that's like purely so bad it's good from start to finish. And that might be the reason why it's only at number 15. Unfortunately, though, it is hard to talk about this movie now in retrospect without bringing up the elephant in the room. Zachary Levi. Now, I'm not sure if this was like known information when I had made my video on Harold and the Purple Crayon a few months back, and if it was, then I just simply didn't know about it until after I made the video. But as it turns out, Zachary Levi is kind of a, no bueno persona, Zachary Levi is like this like anti-woke conspiracy theorist QAnon MAGA anti-vaxxer person. I would have thought that Zachary Levi being a terrible person would have added to the hilarious, funny, bad, dumpster fire nature of this movie, but nah, not really. It kind of takes away from it, actually, if I were to be honest. It makes it kind of hard to praise this movie ironically as a so bad it's good guilty pleasure. I mean, listen, I understand I always have the option to separate the art from the artist, but I don't know. I don't feel like doing it for this movie. I'm not sure if it's worth it to do it for this movie. On a serious note, though, this sucks for me because I think Shazam is a great movie, and so it's like it's gonna be hard rewatching it knowing the kind of person that Zachary Levi is. Again, I understand I could separate the art from the artist, and this time that's like unironic, like I'm not making a haha funny joke here. But listen, sometimes it's like I feel conflicted when it comes to like if I want to separate the art from the artist for a certain piece of media or not. I don't want to say that Shazam is like this perfect 10 out of 10 movie or anything like that, but I like the fun, light-hearted nature of it. I like the fun tone that it has. It feels like a pre-MCU superhero movie, it feels like something that would come out alongside the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy or the first two X-Men movies. It feels like a movie that I would have loved watching as a kid if it had come out in the 2000s. Like I could see myself like rewatching this movie again and again and again as a kid. I wish they made a sequel to this movie, but unfortunately they never did, and they never will. And now it's going to be hard to rewatch this movie knowing exactly the kind of person that Zachary Levi is. One of the only good movies to come out of the DCEU, and now it's permanently ruined just like that. If the DCEU isn't the most cursed movie franchise of all time, I don't want to know what is. Yet another reason why I hope James Gunn is cooking hard with Superman 2025. So anyways, to wrap things up, Harold and the Purple Crayon is a really funny bad movie. If you're able to look past the fact that Zachary Levi is a terrible person, if you're able to unironically separate the art from the artist for this instance, or better yet, if you think Zachary Levi being a QAnon MAGA person, whatever, adds to the funny bad nature of this movie, then well, more power to you, more power to you. But damn, it kind of hurts. This could have been like an inside joke for this channel, and that's not gonna happen now, I don't think. It was fun while it lasted. The theater experience that I had watching this thing is still gonna be in my head forever. So it was fun while it lasted. Don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened, as they say. I wanted to make a joke about how this movie is better than Barbie. This is Barbie if it was a good movie, etc., because there are surprisingly a few similarities between the two movies, but I can't do that, unfortunately. Between the fact that Zachary Levi is a right-wing, MAGA, anti-woke person, and the fact that it is near damn impossible to criticize Barbie in any way, regardless of how valid your criticism is, because of people like Zachary Levi, I can't make that joke, unfortunately. Ain't that a shame. Alright, I think we should move on to number 14 now, before I get even more sad at the fact that my favorite movie ever made is now permanently ruined for me. God damn. Okay, so number 14 is a movie that I'm sure all of y'all are gonna be like, oh come on man, really? This is such an easy target. This is low-hanging fruit, this movie. Are you really gonna go and bash it? What were you expecting from it? And yes, okay, maybe this movie is low-hanging fruit, but number one, this is my list, not your list. I could do whatever I want with my list. And number two, this movie is only at number 14, so it doesn't matter at the end of the day. If this movie was in the bottom 5, then that would be a completely different story. Then I would understand where you're coming from. But it's only at number 14. So yes, even though this movie is low-hanging fruit, it's not that low. Number 14 is Despicable Me 4. Again, I get it. I don't know what I was expecting from the 4th, technically 6th movie in the Despicable Me franchise. But still, I went to go and see this movie because I had nothing better to do. My family was gonna go and see it, and so I figured, fine, I might as well go and watch it as well. Now, excluding the 2 Minions movies, let's look back on the first 3 Despicable Me movies. I will still stand by my belief that the first Despicable Me is a genuinely really good movie. I remember a few years ago, I was at a family gathering and I guess someone decided to put it on. I think it was on Netflix at the time, I don't know. And at first I thought to myself, ugh, not this stupid baby movie. God, the Minions are so cringy. That's like boomer crap right there. God, no. You know, that sort of thing. And then it didn't take long before I found myself rewatching the movie. And I was genuinely surprised to see that the first movie had aged really well. I mean, prior to this, I did see people say that, like, in retrospect, the first movie was the only good Illumination movie, but, you know, I didn't expect it to be this good still. I thought that Illumination's current reputation would affect the way that I would look at this movie, but no. I started watching the movie and it's like, you know, I felt nostalgic for it. It was still a funny movie, and it was surprisingly a lot more heartfelt than I remembered, which again, I would have never expected given Illumination's reputation for making mostly soulless animated movies. Despicable Me turns 15 this year. No, I'm not sorry for making you feel old, and to this day, it still stands as Illumination's best movie. That's kind of sad, honestly. Imagine being this brand new up-and-coming animation studio, and you finally put out your first ever animated movie, and it ends up being an unexpectedly massive hit. All of your future movies would go on to make even more money. They would go on to perform even better than that first movie of yours. And yet, despite that, almost 15 years later, and quality-wise, you peaked with that first movie. You will most likely never reach the same highs that you reached with your first ever movie almost 15 years ago. Damn. And then Despicable Me 2 and Despicable Me 3 are massive downgrades in comparison. But even then, they still have their moments. There are still funny moments from time to time in these 2 movies, and there is still a little bit of that heart that's retained from the first movie in these 2 movies. But overall, I would say they're both a downgrade from the first movie. And yet, despite that though, at least these 2 movies felt like they had a reason to exist. Despicable Me 4 in comparison just feels like this movie exists just for the sake of existing. They decided to make a Despicable Me 4 just for the sake of making a Despicable Me 4. It's like, why not? We can make it. We're able to make it. We might as well make it. I don't know how much sense this is going to make, but there is something weirdly direct-to-video about this movie. Like, I don't know what it is, but like, this is obviously not a direct-to-video movie, and yet it just kind of has like those sort of vibes to it. You think of like the direct-to-video Disney sequels from the 90s and 2000s, and it's like, I don't know, it's mainly with like the storyline, it's mainly with like the ideas that are in this movie that give it this direct-to-video feel. You watch this movie and it's very clear watching it that they're running out of ideas. They're running out of new things to do with these characters. In 2010, the possibilities were endless when it came to what they could do with these characters. In 2024, there are very few possibilities remaining. Stuff like Gru having a son in this movie, just like the superhero minions, the general plot where it's like Gru and his family have to move out of their house and move to like a new community and start a new life. I don't know what it is, it feels like a direct-to-video sequel in terms of like its storyline. Just the vibe I get from it gives off that cheap, low-budget, direct-to-video sequel to Despicable Me vibe, even though this is obviously not a cheap, low-budget, direct-to-video sequel. I think it's also like the villain as well. Now, I don't go into the Despicable Me movies expecting deep, complex villains or anything like that, but there's something about this villain that just makes him feel different from the first three movies' villains. I think it's mainly like the gimmick that he has. You know, the first movie has Vector, and I guess Vector doesn't really have much of a gimmick. I mean, he's nerdy, but like, I don't know if that really counts. I suppose maybe it doesn't really matter for Vector because, you know, this was the first movie, so I guess it's fine. You know, even if Vector doesn't have a gimmick, you know, he's still a fun character to watch, and, you know, that's probably what matters most at the end of the day. And then the second movie has the Mexican wrestler, and then the third movie has the former child star that's obsessed with 80s pop culture. And so, in the 7-year gap between the third Despicable Me and the fourth Despicable Me, you're kind of left wondering what's going to be the villain for this next movie. And so what you end up getting is this comparatively less creative cockroach-themed villain. Again, I don't expect amazing, complex villains from Despicable Me, but there's something about this character that just makes him feel extra generic when compared to the villains of the first three movies. And that kind of adds to the direct-to-video feel that this movie has. He also barely appears in the movie, so there's that as well. Cockroach Guy also has a wife, and she barely does anything in this movie. You could cut her out of this movie and I'm pretty sure nothing would change at all. I'm only briefly bringing her up because Jesus Christ, this might be the worst character design I've ever seen in a movie. But overall though, this is a movie that just kind of fails to justify its existence. Again, the second and third Despicable Me movies felt like they had a reason to exist. Maybe the first Minions movie felt like it had a reason to exist. I'm not sure about Minions 2, but with Despicable Me 4, it just blatantly feels like it has no reason to exist at all. It exists just for the sake of existing. It exists just because they have the ability to make this movie. They could make it, and so they decided to make it. That being said though, this movie does have a few funny moments in it. I know I'm going to lose my animation is cinema privileges for saying this, but sometimes the Minions are funny. I'm sorry. Sometimes I like it when the Minions say banana. You know, it makes me laugh. It makes me go ha 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 ha. Forgive me, Guillermo, for I have sinned. What would Walt say about this if he were still alive? Yes, sometimes the Minions make me laugh in this movie, okay? I'm sorry. I think it's like when it's in small doses, the Minions can be funny. And I think that's part of what made the first movie good. The Minions only appeared occasionally. The occasional comedic relief for the movie. They were used sparingly, and that's what helped make them funny in the first movie. And then because of the massive popularity that they received between the first movie and the second movie, they started getting a lot more attention going forward into the second movie. They started getting more screen time. They started becoming more of a focus. And then despite all of this, in small doses, they can be funny, the Minions. There are a few moments where they can be funny. I'm pretty sure I've officially entered my middle-aged white Facebook mom phase by defending the Minions and claiming that they're funny. But oh well, I suppose it was gonna happen inevitably. I gotta admit something. I saw Minions 2 when it came out, The Rise of Gru, whatever. My family was gonna go and see it, and initially I didn't feel like going with them, but then I decided, what the hell, why not? I have nothing better to do. And I don't know if it was because I was watching it with my family, but I found Minions 2 to be kind of funny. I don't know if I want to call it good, but it was funny from time to time. I laughed at this movie more than I would have expected from Minions 2. If I rewatch this movie, it's probably not going to be all that funny, but I kind of enjoyed it at first. It was like, hey, this is, I went out of the theater and I was like, oh, you know what? That was actually kind of okay. That was pretty decent for Illumination standards. Seeing the Minions become the face of this franchise, though, is a massive shame if you ask me, because Gru is genuinely a funny character as well. Most of the funny moments that are in this movie come from Gru. I'll admit it still feels very direct to video, but there are a few moments where I laughed at Gru trying to be a good dad for his son. The thing is, though, this is mostly for the first half of the movie, is when I was laughing. By the second half, I was like, yeah, this is your standard Illumination fare. Again, it's funny in small doses, and then eventually that funniness kind of just goes away, and you're just dealing with your typical Illumination movie. It never gets to a point where it's like awful or unwatchable or anything like that. You could sit through this movie. It is watchable, but then it's like it kind of loses that surprising funny quality that it had in its first half. The only really notable thing about this movie is that there's a scene in the end where Gru and the cockroach guy are in prison, and they're having a singing contest where they're singing "Everybody Wants to Rule the World" by Tears for Fear. And so you just have all of the villains from the previous movies appear, the first 3 Despicable Me movies, the 2 Minion movies, etc. And then there's a scene where, I kid you not, Vector is flossing, and friendly reminder, this movie came out in 2024. Flossing died around 2021, 2022, maybe even earlier than that, I don't know. But yeah, there you go. The animation is cinema. So to wrap things up, no, Despicable Me 4 isn't really that good of a movie, but at the same time, what the were you expecting from what is technically the 6th Despicable Me movie? Even though this movie feels a lot more tired out, it doesn't really have much of a reason to exist, and watching it, you could very clearly tell they're running out of ideas for what to do with these characters. This is still a money-making franchise. Minion fatigue hasn't kicked in yet. This movie made almost $1 billion at the box office, and it will stand as one of the highest grossing movies of 2024. Clearly, audiences are not tired of the Minions. They're not tired of Gru. They're not tired of any of these characters. And you know what? I gotta be real. I kind of respect Illumination for this. They're making this stuff and they're getting the bag for it. I gotta respect that a little bit. I've mentioned this before, but Illumination has a formula, and it might not necessarily be a good formula, but it's a highly successful formula. It keeps generating money for them. Animation is cinema, motherfuckers are probably jealous that they can't get $969 million, Another L for the animation is cinema crowd. Another W for the middle-aged white Facebook moms. Hell yeah, baby, we stay winning. Yeah, very quickly, I just want to say, this movie has one of the hardest posters I've ever seen from a movie. There's no reason for this to go as hard as it does, and yet it goes unnecessarily hard. And yeah, that's about it. Let's move on, shall we? Number 13 is, for once on this list, not a movie for babies. It is the remake, reboot, I don't know, thing for The Crow. Now I'm gonna start this off by saying that I went into this movie completely blind. I have never seen the original Crow from 1994 with Brandon Lee in it. As a matter of fact, the only thing that I know about this movie is the tragedy that happened with Brandon Lee behind the scenes of this movie. Besides that, I've never seen this movie. I'm sure it's a great movie, but I've never seen it. One thing that I do know about this movie is that this is apparently the only good Crow movie. This movie got 3 subsequent sequels, none of which are very good. 2 of them were direct-to-video, if I'm correct. And then almost 20 years after the last Crow movie, we would get this new rebooted version. Now, this movie was in development hell for a long time. Apparently, development on this movie started all the way back in December of 2008. And so over 15 years later, this movie would finally see the light of day. This movie would finally be coming out in 2024. And let me just tell y'all something. This does not feel like a 2024 movie. This feels like a movie that would come out around like 2016 or 2017. Like you watch this movie and it has this like really like try hard edgy feel to it that fits in perfectly with how things were in 2016 and 2017. But it just feels embarrassing to have a movie like this come out in 2024. You look at the chemistry between the two main characters of the movie, Eric and Shelley, played by Bill Skarsgård and FKA Twigs respectively, and it's going to remind you so much of Jared Leto's Joker and Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn from that one 2016 DC movie that I wish I could say the name of it in this video, but I don't want to risk getting demonetized. And no, I'm not calling the movie On a Live Squad either. I have standards, damn it. I have standards. Actually, this whole movie just reminds me a lot of that 2016 DC movie. This was the first of several movies on this list that I chose to rewatch in order to jog my memory. I got like 10 to 15 minutes into this movie, and then I had to pause it because the chemistry between these two characters reminds me so much of Jared Leto's Joker and Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn. Immediately I began looking up, all of those really cringy, like, deep memes or whatever. Those, like, edgy, like, romantic memes that people would make that, like, oh, these characters are so deep and whatever. These, like, extremely cringy, unintentionally funny memes that people would be making with the Joker and Harley Quinn from that 2016 DC movie. And just imagine an alternate universe where this movie came out in, like, 2017 or so. People would be making these kinds of memes with Eric and Shelley. I could just imagine a timeline where that happened. I'm sure Bill Skarsgård tried his best to save this movie. I'm sure he tried his best to make this movie good, but it is impossible for me to look at his version of The Crow, like even like physically, it looks like Jared Leto's Joker. It reminds me so much of Jared Leto's Joker, to the point where I'm surprised they didn't just get Jared Leto to play the Crow in this movie. We could have gotten the Holy Trinity, guys. We could have gotten the Holy Trinity. And that's a damn shame if you ask me. Now, I will say that this movie can be funny bad at moments. The try-hard edginess of this movie can be funny bad at first. It is funny looking at the I'm 14 and this is deep bullcrap that's just in this movie. The 2017 SoundCloud emo rap aesthetic that it has, even though this movie came out in 2024. It adds to the funny bad nature of this movie, but unfortunately, you get used to it very quickly. Eventually, the funny bad nature of how try-hard edgy this movie is, the parallels that you can make between this movie and that one 2016 DC movie, they stop being funny, and what you're ultimately left with is a movie that's just mostly boring to sit through. So the main villain of this movie is this old rich guy who, I guess his whole thing is like he made a deal with the devil where he would sacrifice innocent people and send them to hell, and in return he would gain immortality. He would be able to live forever. And so there's a few scenes in this movie where you see him sacrificing these people. He goes up to the victim's ear, he just lounges to the victim's ear and he starts whispering some spooky mumbo jumbo or whatever into the person's ear, and then that possesses the victim and it makes them do something that ends their life. And every time it happens, it is so f***ing stupid. It is so ridiculous and goofy looking, and it's like, it's crazy to think the movie wants me to take this seriously, because you watch it and it's like so stupid the way that it's done. It is impossible to take it seriously, and that adds to the funny bad nature that this movie can occasionally have. And I say occasionally again because he only does this 3 times in the entire movie and that's it. At the same time though, maybe it's better that he doesn't do it a lot in this movie because, the try-hard edginess of this movie is funny at first and then it becomes stale after a while. So I could see this whole like ear possession thing you know, it starts off funny and then it just becomes really stale. You know, it's not as funny when he does it the 15th time around. Shelly ends up getting sent to a rehab center where she meets Eric, and upon rewatch, it's around here where this movie not only starts to remind me of that DC movie from 2016 with Jared Leto and Margot Robbie in it, but it also starts reminding me of another movie that came out shortly after The Crow that we're also going to be talking about on this list. When I went to go and see this other movie, I don't know how I didn't notice the similarities between the two movies, but when I got around to rewatching The Crow very recently, I was like, holy shit, this movie has so much in common, so much more in common than I initially expected with this other movie. So which movie does The Crow remind me of that we're going to be talking about later on this list? You're gonna have to wait and see in order to find out. I'm sorry. So then I guess, you know, there's like these people that work for the old rich guy and like they're trying to look for Shelly, and this causes Shelly and Eric to break out together, and while they're breaking out and running away from the rehab center, there's a Joy Division song that's playing in the background. And now Joy Division, for those who don't know, they were a late 70s post-punk gothic rock band. A lot of their songs have a very gloomy, depressing tone to them, which there's like an extra layer of that gets added when you find out what happened to the lead singer of the band, Ian Curtis. You find out about what he had to go through. I would love to go into more detail about this, but I can't because number one, I don't want this video to become unnecessarily grim, and number two, I want to stay on topic. The genuinely depressing nature of Joy Division's music does not fit in at all with the trashy 2017 aesthetic that this movie has. Maybe it would fit the original 1994 movie, but it sure as hell doesn't fit the 2017 emo rap aesthetic that this movie has, despite the fact that, again, this movie came out in 2024, and then a good chunk of the movie is just these two together. It's really cringy and uncomfortable to watch. You're watching it, it's just extremely awkward watching it. I don't know how else to describe it. Eventually, the two of them get caught by the bad guys who suffocate them in a plastic bag. Shelly gets sent down to hell while Eric ends up in this, I don't know, this other world, I guess. And it is here where Eric becomes the Crow, destined to save Shelly and stop this evil rich guy and his henchmen. Most of the movie is just really slow and dull. There are a few action scenes here and there, and yeah, they can be fun to watch, but unfortunately they're mostly pretty short. However, there is one scene in this movie that I want to give special attention to. Near the end of the movie, Eric, as the Crow, goes to this opera, believing that the evil rich guy is there attending the opera. Now, the building is full of the villain's bodyguards, the villain's henchmen, whatever. And so what you end up getting is a solid 10 to 15 minutes, give or take, where you have the Crow going around the building, murdering all of these henchmen, John Wick style, while this opera is going on. And it's like the music is synced up to the murders as well. So it's like the music intensifies during a particularly brutal murder. And then eventually it culminates with Eric walking up to the front of the opera stage, holding up two decapitated heads and throwing them to the audience as they run away screaming. It's bloody, it's violent, and it's fucking amazing. This is the one great moment in the entire movie. I'm not even saying this as like a haha, ironic, so bad it's good thing or anything like that. No, this isn't funny bad. This is a genuinely amazing moment in an otherwise dull, unremarkable movie. This scene is so good that it almost makes you forget about how bad the rest of the movie is in comparison. You're watching this non-stop slaughter that's going on, and you're thinking, damn, this movie is peak, this movie is Kino, and then you remember what the rest of this movie is like, and so you change your mind. You're like, no, this movie actually sucks, it's garbage, never mind, but at least it has one great scene in it, you know, it has that going for it. This movie starts off funny bad with how try-hard edgy it is, and then eventually the try-hard edginess of the movie, you get used to it, and so it stops being funny bad, and you're just bored watching the movie. You're bored for the most part watching this, and then out of nowhere, near the end of the movie, you get this incredible scene that's genuinely a blast to watch. And then this is not where the movie ends. There's still a solid 15 to 20 minutes left of the movie. And then it's like, on the one hand, it sucks that the final few minutes of the movie, you know, you go back to the same garbage quality that the movie has had for the most part, never again reaching the same highs that it reached during the opera scene. But on the other hand, there's only 15 or so minutes left of the movie, so, you know, there's not really much of a point in complaining about it, you know? I read something that the ending of this movie was changed from the original 1994 movie. This movie, I guess, ends with Eric sacrificing himself so that Shelley could still be alive, and I guess this is supposed to tease a sequel, I don't know, but given the fact that this movie did very poorly critically and commercially, I think it's safe to say, yeah, that sequel is never gonna happen. There are enough things about The Crow to put it up this high on the list. There are a few funny bad moments in it, some of the smaller scale action scenes are fun to watch, and the opera scene is a masterpiece in of itself, but the rest of the movie is just extremely dull to sit through. After a while, the try-hard edginess of this movie, the many parallels this movie has to that DC movie from 2016, it stops being funny. You stop laughing at how much these two characters have in common with Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn and Jared Leto's Joker. But you know what? I don't think any of the remaining 12 movies on this list have a scene in them that comes close to being as good as the opera scene, which is why this movie is only at number 13. With all of that said, let us move on to number 12.